The morning Gertrude Leland buried her husband with a borrowed shovel and a borrowed preacher. She saddled her horse before the dirt had even settled over the mound, and she rode the full 42 miles of the Pony Express route herself, alone, in the gathering dark, because the mail did not stop for grief. Thomas Leland had been a good man. Not a remarkable man, not a man whose name would be carved into monuments or whispered in saloons with reverence, but good in the way that quiet men are good, steady, warm, faithful to the root and faithful to her. He had ridden for the Central Overland California and Pikes Peak Express Company since the spring of 1860, carrying letters from Sacramento east through Nevada, pressing through desert and mountain pass, with the kind of determined cheerfulness that had made Gertrude love him in the first place. He had been 28 years old when a rattlesnake spooked his horse on a rocky stretch near Dry Creek Station, and the fall had broken his neck before anyone even knew he was down. Gertrude was 26. She had brown hair that went copper in sunlight and gray eyes that had been described by Thomas as the color of sage after rain, which she had always thought was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever said to her. She was 5 feet and 4 inches of composed practicality. She could mend a saddle, set a bone, calculate a distance by the angle of the sun, and make a meal from nearly nothing. She had been riding since before she could read, had grown up on a Nebraska homestead where softness was a luxury nobody could afford. So she rode the route. The station managers at Dry Creek, at Willow Springs, at Simpson Park, they all stared when she came in alone, when she took the mochila from the dead drop and slung it across her saddle and said, simply, that Thomas would not be coming anymore and that she would be handling things for now. Some of them argued. Old Pete Hadley at Willow Springs had told her it was not proper and not safe, and she had told him, with a patience that cost her considerably, that she understood his concerns, and that he could write to the company if he liked, but the mail needed to move tonight. It had been 3 weeks by the time word reached the regional office in Salt Lake City. The Pony Express in 1861 was already in its strange twilight. The transcontinental telegraph was coming, everyone could feel it, and the company was burning money faster than the riders burned through horses. Still, the mail had to move, contracts had to be honored, and a woman running a section of the route, however competently, was the sort of thing that made men in offices deeply uncomfortable. They sent a replacement. His name was Isaiah Brenner, and he arrived on a Tuesday in late April when the desert was just beginning to show its brief, extravagant spring color. The brittle bush going gold along the hillsides, the occasional burst of red from a cluster of Indian paintbrush. He rode a big roan gelding named Caleb and carried only a single saddlebag, a bedroll, and a Springfield rifle he had not fired at a living thing in 3 years. He was 29 years old, dark-haired and angular, with the kind of face that suggested he had spent a long time outdoors and not nearly enough time comfortable. He had a scar along his left jaw from a bar fight he was not proud of, and a habit of going very still when he was thinking hard, like a hawk on a fence post. He had ridden for the company before, on the Missouri section, and had transferred west after a bout of pneumonia had kept him off the route for 6 weeks, and the eastern stations had filled up. The company letter he carried said that he was to take over the Nevada stretch, sections 7 through 9, and that a Mrs. Leland had been maintaining the route in the absence of a certified rider, and was to be thanked for her service and relieved of the duty. Gertrude was brushing down her horse at the corral behind Dry Creek Station when he rode up. She did not look up immediately. She finished the stroke along the horse's flank, listened to the sound of the new rider's approach, noted the steady pace that suggested someone confident but not reckless, and then set down the brush and turned. He was taller than she expected. He took off his hat, a battered, brown, wide-brimmed thing that had seen better weather, and said, "Beg your pardon, ma'am. I am looking for the station manager or for a Mrs. Leland. I am Isaiah Brenner, and I have been sent by the company to take over the route." Gertrude looked at him for a long moment. She had been expecting this. She had known it was coming. She had rehearsed in her head during long stretches of night riding exactly what she would say, something civil, something measured, something that accepted the situation with the dignity she owed herself. And then she said, "I am Mrs. Leland. You will want to water your horse. The trough is on the left." He blinked. He looked at the horse she had been grooming, a lean, fast bay named Arrow, who had already carried her across 42 miles 3 times this week. And then he looked at her, at the dust on her coat and the practical way her hair was pinned back and the entirely undefeated set of her shoulders. He said, "I see." "Do you?" she said, and it was not really a question. He walked his roan to the trough and let the animal drink, and she went back to brushing Arrow, and the silence between them was not yet comfortable, but it was not hostile either. It was the silence of two people taking careful measure. "The company sent me," he said, eventually. "I am aware," she said. "They want you relieved of the route. I imagine they do." He had the look of a man who had been given a job and was starting to suspect that the job was more complicated than described. He said, "You have been running it alone for 3 weeks. 22 days, she said. "The route runs 42 miles, 3 stations. I have made every single delivery on schedule. I have been faster than the posted time on 14 of the 22 runs." He was quiet for a moment. Caleb lifted his dripping head from the trough. Isaiah Brenner looked at the horizon and then back at Gertrude Leland and said, "I was told you were in need of assistance." "You were told wrong," she said pleasantly. The problem was that he could see she was right, and he was a man who had a powerful discomfort with pretending otherwise. He stayed the night at the station because it was already late and Caleb needed the rest. Pete Hadley fed them both salt pork and cornbread, and a coffee so strong it was practically solid. And over supper, Isaiah Brenner asked her about the route with the same focused attention she imagined he gave everything, asking specific questions about the terrain at the third crossing, about the temperament of the horses kept at Willow Springs, about the best reading of the sky when an afternoon storm was building over the eastern range. He was not asking in the way that people ask when they already know the answer and are testing you. He was asking because he genuinely wanted to know, and he wrote nothing down, but she had the sense that he was recording everything she said with a kind of internal precision. She told him. She found, to her own mild irritation, that she did not resent answering. He asked good questions. "The sorrel at Willow Springs will try to cut left on the second hill," she said, "because there is a spring runoff trail there that she likes. You have to give her a firm knee and let her know you mean straight ahead. She will comply. She is not mean, just hopeful." He almost smiled at that. Almost. The corners of his mouth moved slightly and then settled. She noticed the movement more than she meant to. After supper, she stepped outside and stood under a sky that was all stars and indigo, the kind of sky that only the open west produced, enormous and indifferent and somehow comforting in its enormity. She heard him come out a few minutes later. He stood a few feet away and looked up the same direction she was looking. "I am sorry about your husband," he said. He did not say it the way people usually said it, with the helpless, performing quality of someone trying to demonstrate the right amount of sorrow. He said it plainly, the way you say a true thing. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you. How long were you married?" 4 years. Another silence. An owl called somewhere in the dark scrub beyond the corral fence. She said, "He loved this route. He used to say the desert was the most honest place he had ever been, nothing pretending to be anything it was not." "He sounds like he saw things clearly," Isaiah said. "He did," she said. And then, because the night was large and she was tired in a way that went deeper than muscle, she said, "I am not running the route because I am grieving myself into recklessness. I am running it because I know it and I can, and because stopping would not bring him back, and because sitting still has never been something I was built for." Isaiah Brenner looked at her. In the starlight, the angles of his face were softer, and she could see that he was listening the way people rarely listened, with his whole attention, without preparing his response while she was still speaking. He said, "I believe you." She went back inside before she could think too carefully about why that mattered as much as it did. In the morning, he did something she had not expected. He did not take the mochila. He did not saddle Caleb and head out first. He saddled up alongside her, and when she raised an eyebrow, he said, "I thought I might ride the route with you, learn it properly, if that suits you." "The company wants you to replace me," she said. "The company wants the mail delivered on time," he said. "You are delivering it on time. I see no reason to make something worse in the name of making it official." She studied him. He was not a man given to unnecessary words, and she had learned already in the span of 12 hours that when he said something, he meant it. She said, "You would report to them that you were running it." "I would report that the route is covered," he said. And then very carefully, as if choosing each word from a small, valuable collection, he said, "You do not need replacing, Mrs. Leland. You might consider letting me ride alongside you if you are willing." There was a quality in the way he said it that made her chest do something complicated. She put it firmly to one side because there was mail to move and 42 miles did not ride themselves. "You keep up," she said, "and we will get along fine." He kept up. He was a very good rider, she discovered. Not flashy, nothing about him was flashy, but efficient and attentive, reading the terrain ahead the way an experienced man reads a river, anticipating the trouble spots before they became trouble. He rode Caleb with an ease that spoke of years and miles, and when the roan hit a rough patch of loose shale on the second hill and skittered sideways, Isaiah simply shifted his weight and steadied the animal without drama, the way a person handles a thing they have handled many times before. They made the first station exchange at Willow Springs in good time. The sorrel tried to cut left exactly as Gertrude had said, and she watched from the corner of her eye as Isaiah gave the mare a firm, quiet knee, and she straightened without complaint. He glanced at Gertrude and did not say anything, but the glance said that he had filed the information and found it accurate. They reached the endpoint at Simpson Park just before sundown, handed off the mochila to the eastbound rider, a young man named Eli who was barely 19 and still seemed perpetually startled by the job, and turned back. On the return, the sky went orange and then pink and then a deep, bruised purple, and the desert became something almost dreamlike. Gertrude had ridden this stretch 100 times and she still felt the beauty of it like a hand pressing against her ribs. She looked over at Isaiah, expecting to find him watching the trail, and found him watching the sky with an expression of quiet intensity as if he were trying to memorize it. "Do you paint?" she asked, surprising herself. He looked at her. "No, why?" "You were looking at the sunset the way a painter looks at things." He thought about that. "My mother painted," he said, "watercolors. She used to say that a person who stops seeing beauty in ordinary things is a person who has been poorly taught by their hardships. I suppose the habit is in me somewhere." "That is a very fine thing for a person to believe," Gertrude said. "She was a very fine woman," he said. There was something in his voice that told her his mother was gone, and she did not press it. They rode back to Dry Creek Station in a comfortable quiet that had not existed the night before, and that she noticed the absence of when he went inside and she was alone with Arrow in the corral. Over the following week, they rode together every run. It was not what the company had intended, and Gertrude was not entirely sure what the company would say when Isaiah filed his first report, but she found that she had stopped dreading the question. She was too busy to dread it. She was too occupied with the uncomplicated pleasure of having someone competent riding beside her. Isaiah Brenner was, she discovered, a man of considerable substance beneath the quiet exterior. He had grown up in Ohio, the son of a schoolteacher mother and a father who had worked the canals before they dried up as an industry, and then had gone west to try his hand at cattle, without much success. Isaiah had followed a few years later, taking whatever work presented itself: teamster, scout, ranch hand, before finding in the Pony Express the thing that suited him best, which was being alone on a horse in open country with a clear purpose. He told her this in pieces, not all at once, not in any organized way, but in the manner of a person who is accustomed to keeping things to themselves and is cautiously finding that there is someone worth telling. She learned it the way she learned the land, gradually, by sustained attention, by paying more care to the small details than to any single dramatic revelation. She told him things too. She told him about Nebraska, about the homestead and her father's absolute conviction that the land would reward hard work, which it had sometimes and failed to other times. She told him about learning to ride by being put on a horse with nothing but the instruction to hold on, and how that had seemed terrifying at 9 years old, and had become the most natural thing in the world by the time she was 11. She told him about meeting Thomas at a church social in Kearney, how he had made her laugh 3 times before he had managed to say anything that was genuinely clever, and how she had decided that a man who tried that hard to be funny was a man who wanted very much to make you happy. She told him this one evening while they sat outside the Willow Springs station waiting for the eastbound rider to show, the Sky going through its evening performance, and she watched Isaiah listen to her the way he always listened, still, careful, genuinely present, and she thought that Thomas would have liked him. The thought surprised her. Then it settled into something that felt like rightness. "You miss him differently out here," she said. "In town, everything is reminders. Here, the land does not know him. It is just land. I find that restful. The land does not impose grief on you," Isaiah said. "Yes," she said, "exactly that." He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something that was partly searching and partly careful, as if he was trying to figure out the right distance between two things. Then the eastbound rider came in a clatter of hooves, and the moment passed, and they both moved to do the exchange. But she thought about the expression later, lying in the narrow bunk at the station while Pete Hadley snored on the other side of the wall. She thought about it with more attention than was strictly sensible for an expression that had lasted perhaps 3 seconds. The trouble came at the end of April, the way trouble in the desert often came, fast, out of a clear sky, from a direction nobody had been watching. The company sent a man named Craddock, not a rider, but a supervisor of sorts, a man from the Salt Lake office who had the narrow, official face of someone who valued procedure above almost everything else. He arrived at Dry Creek Station on a Wednesday morning, while Gertrude was reshoeing arrow, and Isaiah was repairing a section of the corral fence, and he introduced himself with the stiff formality of a man who wanted it known immediately that he represented authority. "I am here to conduct a formal review of Section 7 through 9, Craddock said, looking at his papers rather than at either of them. "The company has received the reports from Mr. Brenner and has some questions about the arrangement currently in place." "What sort of questions?" Isaiah asked. He had set down the fence rail and was standing with his arms loose at his sides, which Gertrude had learned was how he stood when he was paying sharp attention. Craddock looked up. He looked at Gertrude. He looked back at his papers. "The company does not employ women riders, Mr. Brenner. Mrs. Leland was performing an emergency service in the absence of a certified rider, for which the company is grateful. But you have been here for 2 weeks, and the arrangement should have reverted to standard operation. The arrangement we have is achieving delivery times that exceed the company average," Isaiah said. "By my count, we have beaten the scheduled time on 11 of the 14 runs since my arrival." "The arrangement is irregular," Craddock said. Gertrude set down the horseshoe she was holding and straightened up. She said, "Mr. Craddock, I rode this route for 22 days alone before Mr. Brenner arrived. Not a single piece of mail was lost. Not a single delivery was late. I know this terrain in ways that are not in any company ledger, because I have ridden it in every kind of weather and at every hour of the day and night. If the company wishes to waste that knowledge and experience in the name of propriety, that is the company's choice. But I would ask you to think about whether that choice serves the people who are waiting for their mail." Craddock was quiet. He was the kind of man who was not accustomed to women speaking directly at him like that, and she could see him deciding whether to be offended or to actually consider the argument. After a moment, he said, "The company has a responsibility to its image as well as to its operations." "The company has a responsibility to deliver the mail," Isaiah said, and his voice was level, but there was something underneath it, something that Gertrude recognized as a man who has decided how he feels about a thing and is not going to be argued out of it. "Mrs. Leland is the most capable person on this section of the route. She knows every inch of it. She can read this landscape, and this weather better than anyone I have worked alongside in 9 years of riding. The idea that she requires replacing simply because she is a woman would be funny if it were not so wasteful." Craddock looked between them. He had the look of a man who had arrived expecting a simple administrative correction and had instead walked into something considerably more complicated. He said, "I will need to submit a formal report." "Submit whatever you need to," Gertrude said. "The mail will have moved by the time you finish writing it." Craddock stayed 2 more days observing. She could feel him watching on the morning ride, when she and Isaiah moved through the dawn desert with the mochila slung across Arrow's saddle, and the sky going from black to deep blue to a blinding white gold. And she rode with the precise, unhurried confidence she always rode with, not performing for him, just doing the work the way the work needed to be done. She saw him making notes. She did not ask what he was writing. On the second evening, he found her sitting alone outside the station, Arrow's bridle across her knees, working a stiff section of the leather back to suppleness with oil in her hands. The sun was going down and the air had the cool, clean quality it got in the desert evenings, scrubbed of the day's heat and smelling of sage and dust and something mineral and ancient. Craddock sat down on the fence rail across from her. He said without preamble, "How do you know you are not simply being reckless? Grief does strange things to people's judgment." She looked up at him. She said, "Because I am not doing this because of grief. I am doing this because I am good at it." She paused, and then she said, "Mr. Craddock, Thomas would have been the first person to tell you that I should not be replaced simply because he was gone. He was not that kind of man. He would have found the idea insulting to both of us." Craddock was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I will recommend a formal shared position to the company. It is unprecedented, but the numbers support it." She did not thank him effusively, because that would have diminished something. She said, "That is a reasonable decision." He left in the morning, heading back toward Salt Lake, and Gertrude stood in the doorway of the station and watched his horse diminish into the distance and felt something loosen in her chest that she had not realized was tight. Isaiah came to stand beside her. He said, "I meant what I said to him." "I know," she said, "about all of it." She glanced sideways at him. He was looking out at the desert, at the direction Craddock had gone, and his profile in the morning light was the face of someone who has said the exact thing he intended to say and is comfortable with that fact. She said, "Isaiah." He turned. She said, "Thank you." He held her gaze for a moment, and she felt the slight, careful shift in the air between them, the way it shifted when two people are standing on the edge of something neither of them has named yet. Then he said, "You do not need to thank me for telling the truth." She went back inside to get her hat and gloves and saddlebag, and she did not look back at him, but she was smiling in a way she was glad he could not see, because she was not yet ready to explain it, even to herself. May arrived with a heat that the spring flowers had not prepared anyone for, sudden, wall-like, the kind of heat that rose from the desert floor in visible waves by mid-morning. Gertrude and Isaiah adjusted their rides, starting earlier in the predawn dark when the air was cool and clean, reaching the far station before the worst of the midday sun, resting during the peak heat hours, and riding back in the late afternoon when the light went golden and long-shadowed. It was in those early morning rides, in the dark before the sun was up, that she found she knew him best. There was something about riding beside someone in the dark that stripped away the performative quality that daylight sometimes imposed. You could not see each other clearly, only hear the breathing of horses and the sound of hooves on packed earth and the occasional voice. And in that particular intimacy, she found that Isaiah Brenner talked more freely than he did in the full light of day. He told her about the things he had seen, the way the Great Plains looked in a blizzard, which was nothing like snow looked anywhere else, which was white nothingness in every direction, as if the world had been erased. He told her about a summer he had spent at a cattle operation in Wyoming where the owner's wife had taught him 36 card games and the best method of making bread when the oven was uncertain. He told her one morning when they were riding through a stretch of Joshua trees that looked ghostly and strange in the predawn, about a girl he had been engaged to in Ohio, who had ended the engagement when she understood that he would never stay in one place long enough to build what she wanted to build. He said it without bitterness, just the plain truth of it. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "That you could not be what she needed?" "No," he said. "I think she was right to end it. I would have made her unhappy by making myself unhappy, and that is not kindness. It is only a slower damage. That is honest. I prefer honest." She thought of Thomas again, Thomas who had loved the open road as much as she had, who had understood that she would never be content with a parlor and a patch of garden, who had loved her completely and left her too soon. She said, "Thomas was honest too. It was one of the first things I loved about him. He always said exactly what he meant, even when it was inconvenient." "You speak of him often," Isaiah said, not accusatorially, observingly. "Does that bother you?" He thought about it, genuinely considered the question rather than giving the answer that would be easy. He said, "No, he was part of your life. He helped make you who you are. I would not want you to pretend otherwise." The Joshua trees moved slowly past them in the dark. A coyote called somewhere to the south, a long, trailing sound that the desert absorbed. She thought about what he had said and found that it sat in her chest like something warm. The company's formal response to Craddock's report arrived in mid-May. It was, by any measure, a document of grudging compromise. The company would permit the shared arrangement for the remainder of the contract period, which ran through the summer, after which the situation would be reviewed. They would pay Isaiah his full writer's wage and Gertrude a wage that was, she noted without visible reaction, somewhat less, which was an injustice she filed away with the pragmatic acceptance of someone who had encountered this particular injustice before and knew exactly what it was and what it was not worth letting make her small. "I am going to write to them about the wage," Isaiah said when she showed him the letter. "Don't," she said. "It is not equitable." "No," she agreed. "It is not. But if you write to them, they will use it as a reason to revisit the arrangement entirely, and I would rather be employed at an unfair wage than be removed from the route while they argue about propriety again." He was frustrated by this. She could see it in the set of his jaw. He said, "That is not right." "No," she said again quietly. "It is not. The world is full of things that are not right, Isaiah. You pick your battles by which ones you can win." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "When the contract period ends, I am going to say something." "When the contract period ends," she said, "you can say whatever you like." Something shifted in the way he looked at her when she said that, something that went beyond the conversation they were having, something that was considering the phrase "when the contract period ends" and what might exist after it. And she felt her own heart do a quick, complicated thing in response, and then she looked away, out at the desert, which was reliably indifferent to such feelings and therefore comforting. In late May, they had their first real disagreement. It was about a stretch of the route near a dry wash about 12 miles east of Willow Springs, where recent rain had destabilized the bank. Gertrude had been taking a slightly longer alternative path around the worst of it for the past 2 weeks, adding perhaps 20 minutes to that leg of the journey. Isaiah argued for the direct route with some minor modifications to their speed and approach. Gertrude argued that 20 minutes of caution was worth considerably more than a damaged horse or a rider with a broken leg at the bottom of a wash. They argued about it for the better part of an evening outside the station, while Pete Hadley sat inside making a studied effort to look like he could not hear them. "You cannot maintain 20-minute detours indefinitely," Isaiah said. "The terrain will solidify within another few weeks. By June the rains are done." "It is not June yet," she said. Last spring, a rider on the southern route broke 2 ribs and lost a horse on a bank that everyone agreed was safe enough. His name was Marcus Webb, and he was out of commission for a month. The mail does not have to move if the rider is lying in a wash. I am not arguing for recklessness. Then what are you arguing for? He stopped. He looked at her. And she saw that he was not arguing out of stubbornness or pride. He was arguing because he had looked at the terrain and come to a genuinely different conclusion, and the frustration was not at her, but at the fact that 2 careful people could look at the same piece of land and see different levels of risk in it. He said, "You have seen this terrain in more conditions than I have." "Yes," she said. "Then we take the detour until you are satisfied the bank is stable." She blinked. She had expected him to keep arguing. She said, "That is it. You know the land better than I do," he said simply. "I should not argue from a position of less knowledge." She stood there for a moment in the evening air and felt the argument drain out of her and leave behind something unexpectedly moved. She said, "Most men would argue until they won, just for the sake of winning." "I am not most men," he said. He said it without vanity, just as a plain statement of fact. She believed him. They took the detour for another 10 days, until Gertrude had walked the bank on foot 3 mornings running and confirmed that the soil had compacted sufficiently. She told him it was stable, and they went direct again, and the matter was closed. And the ease with which it was closed made her trust him in a way that she had not quite trusted him before, which was considerable given that she had already trusted him with the route and with the dark morning conversations, and with more of herself than she had shared with anyone in a long time. June came in hot and golden and enormous. The desert in summer was a different creature than the desert in spring, ruthless with its sun, stingy with its shade, capable of a silence so absolute it felt like a sound itself. She and Isaiah had fallen into a rhythm that had the quality of something much longer established than 6 weeks, moving through their days with an ease and coordination that Pete Hadley had once compared, with a wry squint, to a well-matched team of horses, which had made Gertrude laugh properly for the first time in months. She had started laughing again. She noticed this. It had not been an absence she was consciously aware of until the laughing returned, and then she recognized that she had been moving through the previous months on determination alone, without the lighter register, without the color of it. Isaiah made her laugh in the dry, reluctant way of someone who has decided that humor is worth the effort, with observations so precisely timed and so specifically observed that they caught her off guard every time. He told her once, watching a horned lizard make its stately, indignant way across the trail in front of them, that it had the walk of a man who had just been told his opinion was not required. She had laughed so abruptly that Arrow turned his head in surprise. He was not performing for her, that was the thing. He said funny things the same way he said serious things, with the same contained, considered quality, as if the world was constantly offering up observations, and he was simply doing her the courtesy of sharing the ones that seemed worth sharing. She was falling in love with him. She knew it by late June, recognized it with the same clear-eyed directness that she applied to everything. She did not panic about it or try to argue herself out of it or feel guilty about it. She had heard from older women who had lost husbands that the world would provide its own timeline for the heart, regardless of what propriety suggested, and that a person who loved again was not betraying the first love but honoring the capacity for it. She believed this. She had believed it before it became relevant to her. But knowing it and knowing what to do about it were different things, and she was not the sort of person who acted without thinking. She was particularly not the sort of person who acted on a thing this significant without being reasonably certain of what she was acting toward. She was fairly certain, but fairly certain and Isaiah Brenner were 2 concepts she was not ready to put in the same sentence yet, because fairly certain with someone like Isaiah meant something. It was not light, it was not casual, and she was not sure she was ready for something that was not light or casual. She thought about this a great deal during the long hot afternoons when they rested at Willow Springs. in the shade of the station's overhanging roof, drinking water that always tasted slightly of the canteen, and watching the heat shimmer over the flat ground. Isaiah would often spend this time reading. He carried a small, battered collection of essays by a man named Emerson that he had read so many times the spine had given up entirely. Or he would sit quietly with his hat over his eyes and rest with the precise efficiency of a man who understood that rest was a skill as much as writing was. She would mend things or write in the small journal she had kept since childhood, or simply sit and let the heat and the silence press against her and think about what she wanted. What she wanted was, she found, increasingly simple to identify. She wanted the root. She wanted this desert, this sky, this particular quality of silence. She wanted to keep doing work that mattered with competence and freedom. And she wanted Isaiah Brenner, specifically and particularly, riding beside her. The difficulty was that she did not know what Isaiah wanted in any direction that was not the immediate and practical. It was Pete Hadley, of all people, who settled the question. Pete Hadley, who was 63 years old and had been married to the same woman for 40 years, and who had a way of seeing things plainly that came from having no patience left for complication. He pulled Gertrude aside one evening in late June while Isaiah was in the corral and said, in the blunt, affectionate way of someone who has been watching a situation develop for long enough to feel entitled to an opinion, "That man looks at you the way a person looks at a thing they cannot afford to want." Gertrude said, "Pete, I am just observing," he said, spreading his hands in a gesture of absolute innocence. "You are meddling," she said. "I am sharing an observation." He tilted his head. He has also asked me 3 times, in what I think he believed was a casual manner, whether I knew anything about your circumstances, whether you were planning to stay west, whether you had family elsewhere, whether you were, he paused, happy. She was quiet. He asked whether you were happy, Pete said again, more softly. A man who wants nothing does not ask whether a woman is happy. She went to sleep that night turning this over in her mind, looking at it from different angles, and when she woke before dawn for the morning ride she found Isaiah already at the corral, already saddling Caleb, the lantern light catching the angles of his face, and the way he looked up when he heard her come out, with that specific quality of attention that she now recognized as directed only at her. She saddled Arrow and they rode out into the predawn dark without speaking for the first several miles, as was their habit, and the desert was vast and cool and full of stars, and she could hear his breathing and Caleb's hooves and the sound of her own heart. Then she said, "Isaiah." "Yes," he said. "I am glad you came," she said. Not as a preamble, not as a setup to something larger, just the plain truth of it offered simply. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I was not expecting that." "Expecting what?" "You." He said it carefully, precisely, in the way he said things he had considered. "When they sent me out here, I had a very clear idea of what the job was. I had not expected to find someone who made the job better by being in it, who made," he stopped, started again. "I had not expected to find you, Gertrude." She let the sound of her name settle around her in the dark. He almost never used her first name. When he did, it had a weight to it that she felt all the way through. She said, "What are you saying exactly?" "I am saying," he stopped his horse. She stopped Arrow. They were sitting still in the middle of the desert in the dark, the stars overhead, the sage smell in the air, 2 horses breathing patiently. He said, "I am saying that I have been trying, very carefully, not to make assumptions or to act on anything that was not invited. But I think about you in ways that go well past the professional, and I would like to know if that is," he paused again. "I would like to know what that is." She could see him in the dark, just the shape of him, the line of his shoulders, the slight angle of his head toward her. She said, "It is not unwelcome." She heard him exhale. She said, "I am not a woman who says things she does not mean, so when I tell you that I have come to depend on you in ways that have nothing to do with the root, you can take that seriously." "I take everything you say seriously," he said. "I know," she said. "That is one of the reasons." They sat there for another moment in the dark, not moving. Something settled between them that had not been settled before. And then Arrow shifted and the moment eased into something less contained, and she said, "The mail does not wait." And they rode on, but there was something different in the air between them, something that had been named, and she felt it like the first real warmth of spring after a long winter. He did not rush the thing. She appreciated this enormously. He was not the kind of man to go from an admission to an expectation in a single breath. He moved with the same patience on this as he moved on everything, with the understanding that good things needed time and that pressing them did not speed them, only bruised them. What changed was the small things. He brought her coffee in the mornings without being asked, having learned exactly how she took it strong, with no sugar because she found sweet coffee an unnecessary complication of something that was already good. He saved the best shade spots at midday rest, not obviously, just always ended up there naturally. In the evenings he would sometimes sit closer than he had before, close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching as they looked at the horizon, and she would not move away, and he would not push further, and in the shared restraint of it there was a quality that was more romantic than anything more dramatic could have been. She touched his hand one evening in early July, deliberately, simply, placing her fingers over his where they rested on the fence rail. He went very still the way he went still when he was thinking hard. Then he turned his hand over under hers and held it, and she could feel his pulse in his palm. He said quietly, "I was beginning to think I would spend my life running a route somewhere," and never he stopped. "Never what?" she said. "Never having something I was reluctant to ride away from." She looked at him. The sunset was doing extraordinary things behind him, the sky in 4 colors simultaneously, and she thought about the person she had been 22 days after Thomas died, riding 42 miles alone in the dark, holding herself together by sheer force of will. She thought about who she was now in July, with this man's hand warm under hers, and the difference was not the absence of grief or the absence of Thomas. The difference was that she was no longer simply surviving. She was here, present, alive in the full sense of the word. She said, "Then do not ride away." He looked at her for a long, still moment. Then very carefully, as if the motion required everything he had, he raised his free hand and touched her face, just his fingertips against her cheek, brief and impossibly gentle, and she leaned into it slightly, just slightly, and he saw her do it, and something opened in his expression that she had never seen before, something unguarded and wondering. Pete Hadley's voice came through the station wall asking if either of them wanted more cornbread, and they both laughed, and the spell broke into something warmer and more ordinary, and she did not mind. Ordinary was something she had learned to value enormously. In mid-July, Eli, the young eastbound rider, was thrown from his horse at the 3rd station and came in with a dislocated shoulder and 2 cracked ribs, and the eastbound run was short a rider for 3 days while arrangements were made. Gertrude and Isaiah split the additional work without discussion, each taking on extra legs, covering the gap with a practicality that left everyone at the stations quietly impressed. On the second night of the extended schedule, they found themselves both at Simpson Park for the first time at the same hour, waiting out a thunderstorm that had built up out of the southwest with the sudden decisive violence of high desert weather. The rain came in a solid, roaring sheet, the kind of rain that turned the hardpan to grease and the dry washes to moving water in minutes, and they watched it from under the station's broad overhang, the horses safe in the station's small barn, the thunder rolling across the ranges like something enormous making itself comfortable. The station manager at Simpson Park was a taciturn man named Donahue who fed them beans and dried venison, and then went to sleep with the indifference of someone who had been through too many storms to find them interesting anymore. They sat alone at the rough table with the lantern between them and the rain loud on the roof, and the closeness of it, the storm shutting the world down to this small lit circle, had a quality of intimacy that felt both accidental and entirely right. She told him something she had not told anyone. She told him about the first night she had ridden the route alone, after Thomas's death, not the practical version, not the composed version she had given to Pete Hadley and to Craddock, but the real version. She told him that she had cried for the first 12 miles, crying and riding at the same time, with the reins in her hands and the dark sky above her, and the grief coming out of her like something that had been locked and had been let go. She told him that at the 13th mile she had stopped crying because she had noticed a meteor, a long white scratch across the black sky, and something about its simple, indifferent beauty had converted the grief, for a moment, into something else. Awe maybe, or just presence. I thought, she said, that Thomas would have liked to see it. And then I thought that maybe, wherever he was, he did see it. And that was enough to keep me going to the 14th mile and from there to the rest. Isaiah was looking at her across the lantern light, with an expression so open and so careful that she felt it like a hand pressed gently over her whole heart. "You are," he said, "the strongest person I have ever known." "I am not," she said. "I am just someone who had no acceptable alternative to keeping going." "That is what strength is," he said, "not the absence of fear or grief, just the decision to keep going when they are present." The rain was very loud and very constant, and the lantern cast warm shadows, and she reached across the table and took his hand in both of hers and held it, and he held back, and they sat like that for a long time while the storm said its piece and eventually wore itself out and the night went quiet. He kissed her for the first time outside that station in the hour before dawn, when the storm had passed and the desert was still wet and the air smelled like every good thing, rain and sage and clean stone, and the stars had come back out, hard and clear as promises. It was not dramatic. There was no speech before it and no ceremony. He simply turned to her in the quiet and looked at her, and she looked back, and he said her name once, just Gertrude. And then he kissed her softly with exactly the same quality of careful attention that he brought to everything. She kissed him back. Her hands came up and held his face, and she felt him take a breath through his nose and then steady, and the kiss went from soft to something truer, something that said, "I have been waiting for this, and I have been afraid of this, and I am glad of this all at once." And the wet desert shone around them and the stars burned overhead, and it was one of those moments that a person knows, while it is happening, that they will carry it for the rest of their life. When they separated, she put her forehead against his and they stood like that for a moment, breathing. He said quietly, "I have been thinking about that for a long time." "How long?" she said. "Since the first morning," he said. "When you looked at me and asked if I had watered my horse, and you said it with such complete composure that I thought, this is a woman who has nothing to prove to anyone, and I have never encountered that before." She laughed, warm and genuine, and he smiled a full smile, one of the rare ones, and it changed his face entirely, made him look younger and lighter, and she thought that she wanted to be the person who caused that smile for as long as they were both alive. August arrived with a letter from the company that they had both been partly dreading and partly knowing was coming. The transcontinental telegraph was nearly complete. The line that ran from the Missouri River to Sacramento was closing the gap from both ends with iron-willed efficiency, and the Pony Express, which had always been a stopgap, a bridge between moments in history, was coming to its end. The letter set a provisional closing date in October. All riders were thanked for their service. All station contracts would be honored through the end of the calendar year. She read it twice and then set it down on the table and looked out at the desert through the station window. Isaiah read it after her and set it down and looked at her. She said, "Well, well," he said. "It was always going to end," she said. "The telegraph was always coming." "Yes," he said. She turned the letter over in her mind. The route ending was not the thing that pressed on her. She had known this day was coming since, before Thomas died, had accepted the impermanence of the Pony Express as a fact of the enterprise. What pressed on her was the larger question that the letter made unavoidable. What came after? She said, "I have been thinking about land." He looked at her. "The homestead laws," she said. 160 acres. I know the land east of Willow Springs, 6 miles out. There is a spring there that runs year-round. Thomas and I talked about it once, in passing, as something that might be possible after the route." She stopped. Then she said, "I could file for it myself. The law does not prohibit it for widows." Isaiah was quiet. She watched him think, watched the hawk stillness come over him that meant he was considering something with full attention. He said, "Gertrude." "Yes." "Is that what you want, a homestead, that particular piece of land?" "Yes," she said. "I have known it since spring." He said very carefully, "Would you be amenable to a different kind of arrangement? For the filing?" She looked at him. She could feel her heartbeat in the palms of her hands. He said, "I am asking you very imperfectly, and I know the timing is—" He stopped, started again. "I have wanted to ask you this since July, but I could not find the words that were exactly right, and I am still not entirely sure they are right." But he took a breath. "Gertrude Leland, I would like to build something with you. I would like to file on that land with you. I would like, if you are willing, to spend the rest of my life riding beside you in every sense of the phrase." He paused. "I am asking you to marry me. Imperfectly, without a ring, and in a station that smells of horses." But entirely sincerely. She looked at him for a long moment. She felt the enormity of the question and found that it was not frightening. It was the opposite of frightening. It was the kind of thing that, when it arrives, you recognize immediately as the thing you have been moving toward. She said, "Isaiah, I accepted the fact that I was in love with you 6 weeks ago. The question of what to do about it was only ever a question of timing, and yours is, for the record, impeccable." He let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for a very long time. She crossed the space between them and took his face in both hands the way she had the first time she kissed him, and he held her by the waist, and she said, "Yes, obviously yes. I cannot imagine who else I would build it with." They were married at Willow Springs Station in early September, with Pete Hadley standing as witness and an itinerant preacher named Reverend Cole performing the service under a sky that could not have been more blue if it had been painted. Eli, recovered from his ribs and his shoulder and enormously delighted by the whole situation, stood on Pete's other side with his hat in his hands and cried without embarrassment. Donahue from Simpson Park had ridden the distance to attend and stood at the back in his habitual silence, but with an expression of unmistakable satisfaction. Gertrude wore her best dress, which was blue calico and had been pressed with great care, and she had done her hair differently from usual, leaving some of it loose around her face. And Isaiah stood opposite her in a clean shirt and his least battered jacket, and looked at her with the concentrated, open expression that she had first seen on his face across a lantern in a storm, and she felt the look all the way through. The Reverend was brief and sincere. When he asked if Isaiah took this woman, Isaiah said, "I do," with such quiet force that Pete Hadley made a short sound that was very nearly a sob. When he asked if Gertrude took this man, she said, "I do," and met Isaiah's eyes and saw in them exactly what she had put in her own voice, which was, "Completely, and with full knowledge of what I am choosing." Pete Hadley produced a bottle of decent whiskey from somewhere deep in the station's provisions, and they drank a toast in tin cups in the September sun, and Eli told a joke that was only somewhat appropriate, and Donahue shook Isaiah's hand with the solemn weight of someone delivering a formal endorsement, and Gertrude stood in the middle of it all and thought about Thomas with love and without anguish, thought that he would have been pleased by this, by her standing in the sun and happy. And she let the thought be warm instead of sad. The route ended on the 26th of October, 1861, the day the final telegraph line was connected, and the transcontinental message moved from coast to coast in minutes rather than days. Gertrude and Isaiah rode the last run together, the Machilla light, the morning clear and enormous, and when they handed off at Simpson Park for the last time and turned for home, she looked back once at the trail behind them, 42 miles of desert and sage and rock, the route she had ridden in grief and in defiance and in companionship and in love, and she thought that she would not have changed a single mile of it. Isaiah looked back too, at the same moment, and their eyes met, and he reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, and she held it, and they rode back together through the enormous golden light of the Nevada desert in October, toward the land that was theirs. They filed for the homestead in the first week of November, 160 acres east of what had been Willow Springs Station, with the year-round spring that Gertrude had identified in the early spring and held in her mind like a piece of stored treasure. The land office clerk in the nearest town, a place called Reeves Crossing, a small, provisional gathering of buildings that wanted badly to be a proper town, had looked at them both across the counter with the slightly suspicious expression of someone confronted with something outside his previous experience. And Isaiah had laid the paperwork down with the patient exactness of a man who had read the law carefully and was prepared to explain it sentence by sentence if necessary. They walked out with the filing receipt, and she folded it and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, close to her chest. They built the house themselves, with help from Pete Hadley and a taciturn carpenter from Reeves Crossing named Marsh who could do extraordinary things with green timber and was almost entirely silent while doing them. It was not a large house, a main room, a kitchen area, 2 sleeping rooms, a covered porch that faced west toward the evening sky, but it was solid and well-positioned and sat on the land with the right kind of permanence. Gertrude had opinions about every element of it, which Isaiah received with complete seriousness and incorporated where possible, and only pushed back on when he had a structural argument, which she found perfectly reasonable. They moved in before Christmas, not because the house was entirely finished. The second sleeping room still lacked its window, but because winter was closing in and a sleeping room without a window was still a room. She hung her mother's quilt on the wall of the main room, and Isaiah put his battered Emerson on the shelf above the fireplace, and between those 2 objects and the fire in the hearth it became something she recognized as home in the deepest sense of the word. Pete Hadley had a small operation a few miles to the west, a combination of station keeping for the freight wagons that had partly replaced the Pony Express routes, and a modest cattle enterprise that he ran with 2 hands. He came for Christmas dinner and ate with the satisfaction of a man who considered himself responsible for good outcomes he had not technically engineered, which Gertrude considered entirely fair. He called her Mrs. Brenner, which she had not yet entirely adjusted to, and she appreciated the way Isaiah glanced at her when Pete said it, checking that she was all right with it, and the way she nodded back and the small private communication of it, that shorthand of a shared life just beginning. On a cold, clear night in January, lying in the bedroom of the house they had built, listening to the wind carry itself across the desert outside, she said to Isaiah, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," he said. "I was afraid, after Thomas, that I had used up the part of myself that could do this, that could love someone with the whole weight of it. I was afraid that that capacity had been not destroyed but permanently reduced somehow by the loss." He was very still beside her. "I was wrong," she said, "in case you wanted to know." He reached for her hand under the quilt and held it against his chest over his heart, and she could feel the beat of it steady and unhurried. He said, "I was afraid of a different version of the same thing, that I would always be someone who was better at being alone than being with someone. That the alone of it had become too native to me to change." "Was that wrong too?" she said. "Entirely wrong," he said. She moved closer against the warmth of him, and the wind went on outside and the fire in the main room sent its faint heat through the house, and she thought that the life they were building had the right quality of realness to it. Not perfect, no life was perfect, and she had been in the desert long enough to know that honest things were not smooth things but real. Chosen. Deeply, deliberately chosen. By spring of 1862, the homestead had taken on its working shape. Isaiah had built a proper barn that housed Caleb and Arrow, and 2 additional horses they had purchased from a ranch operation outside Reeves Crossing, a steady draft animal for the wagon, and a young mare that Gertrude had picked for her intelligence and her willingness. She had planted a kitchen garden on the south side of the house, working the ground in the iron-cold early mornings of March, and she had started a small correspondence with a woman in Sacramento who traded seeds, and the garden had promised by April to be something. Isaiah had taken work as a scout for a freight company that ran wagons through the region twice monthly, which gave them income while the homestead found its feet and kept him in the saddle, and in the open country that was his native element. He was gone 4 or 5 days at a stretch, and she managed the homestead in his absence with the same self-sufficient competence she brought to everything, and when he came back, there was always the quality of reunion to it, not dramatic, not performed, just the warm, particular rightness of someone returning to a place that was made better by their presence. She was expecting their first child by May. She knew it before she told anyone, carrying the knowledge for 2 weeks with a private joy that she let herself feel fully before making it shared. She told Isaiah on a May evening, standing in the kitchen garden with the last of the daylight gold on the hills beyond, just said it plainly, the way she said everything that mattered. His face went through a sequence of expressions she had never seen on it before: shock, then something trying very hard to be composed, then failing completely at composure, and becoming something that was entirely and openly joy, the kind that did not care about witnesses. He held her face in his hands and she could feel them trembling slightly, and he said, "Gertrude, are you well? Are you?" "I am well," she said, laughing. "I am very well, I am fine." He laughed too, a full laugh, head back, the kind she had been collecting since September, adding them to the record of good things. He said, "I am going to be," he stopped, said, "a father." "Apparently so," she said. He wrapped his arms around her carefully, as if she were suddenly made of something more precious than she had been 10 minutes before, and she pressed her face into his shoulder and said, muffled, "Isaiah, I am not fragile." "I know," he said, holding on anyway. She let him. Their son was born in November of 1862, on a cold, clear morning that broke brilliant over the eastern hills, while Gertrude labored in the bedroom with the midwife from Reeves Crossing, a capable, warm woman named Mrs. Alcott. And Isaiah maintained a vigil of controlled anxiety in the main room that Pete Hadley, who had insisted on being present for the occasion, monitored with the practiced calm of someone who had been through it himself decades ago. The boy came into the world with a decisive cry that filled the house, and Mrs. Alcott called Isaiah in, and he stood in the doorway of the bedroom looking at Gertrude in the bed with the small, red-faced, emphatically alive person in her arms, and his face had the quality of a man looking at something that has permanently rearranged his interior landscape. She said, "Come and meet your son." He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby into his arms, and he held the child with the instinctive, concentrated care of someone encountering something entirely new and deciding immediately that it was the most important thing in the world. The baby looked up at him with the unfocused intensity of the newly arrived. "He looks like he has opinions already," Isaiah said. "He is a Brenner," Gertrude said. "It is to be expected." They named him Thomas. She had suggested it, and Isaiah had received the suggestion with the same open, generous quality that had characterized their entire marriage, without jealousy, without insecurity, with the simple understanding that a name was a form of love, and that honoring the dead did not diminish the living. Thomas Isaiah Brenner arrived in the world with the full weight of 2 histories behind him and a future ahead that his parents were already, quietly and determinedly, working to make worthy of him. Pete Hadley held the baby for a solid hour and argued with Mrs. Alcott about whether he had Thomas's nose or Gertrude's nose, and the argument had the comfortable, irrelevant quality of people in a warm house after a good outcome, and Gertrude lay in the bed and watched Isaiah watch their son, and felt something settle in her that was so complete it was almost wordless. By the spring of 1863, the homestead was genuinely productive. The cattle operation was modest, but sound 12 head that Isaiah was expanding carefully, buying quality over quantity in the way he did everything. The garden had exceeded Gertrude's first-year expectations, and she had begun supplying a portion of the vegetable surplus to Reeves Crossing, which was growing steadily, acquiring a proper general store and a schoolhouse and the dignified ambitions of a town that intends to persist. The freight scouts' work had become a regular arrangement, and Isaiah's knowledge of the terrain, informed now not only by years of riding but by Gertrude's deeper, more intimate understanding of the land they lived on, made him one of the most valued men on the route. They rode together still, when there was occasion. Not the Pony Express. That chapter was closed. The telegraph wires stood where the riders had run, but the land was the land, and there were always reasons to ride it. She rode beside him in the early morning sometimes, in the predawn dark that she had always loved best, the two of them moving through the desert silence while Thomas slept in his crib, and the stars burned overhead. And those rides had the quality of everything she had loved best about the route, the space, the clean air, the sense of moving through something enormous with a direction and a purpose, but also something added to it. Something that was the particular quality of riding beside someone who was both companion and home. She told him, on one of those mornings, about the day she had decided to keep riding the route after Thomas's death. Not the exterior version she had described before, not even the version she had told him during the storm at Simpson Park, but the innermost version, the one she had not put into words for anyone. She told him that it was not only grief management or duty or stubbornness. It was that riding the route alone in the dark, she had felt herself to be entirely herself, not someone's widow, not someone in the middle of a tragedy, but Gertrude, woman on a horse in the desert, carrying mail, knowing the land, capable and alive. That the route had given her back herself at a moment when she might have dissolved into the grief. Isaiah listened the way he always listened. Then he said, "The route gave you back yourself, and then you gave the route back to yourself." "Yes," she said, "exactly that. And then I arrived to replace you," he said, with a dry quality that she had come to know as his particular brand of humor. "And then you arrived," she said, "and told me I did not need replacing, which was," she paused. "That was the beginning of everything." He reached across and found her hand in the dark the way he had on the last morning of the route. She held it. Arrow and Caleb moved together at an easy walk. The desert opened ahead of them in the predawn, and she thought of all the miles they had covered and all the miles still ahead, and the particular rightness of covering them together. The second child came in the autumn of 1864, a daughter they named Clara, who arrived in the world with red hair that puzzled everyone and eyes that shifted from blue to gray and back again in different lights. Thomas, who was nearly 2 and had strong views about most things already, received his sister with the wary acceptance of someone prepared to give a newcomer a fair trial. By Christmas, the trial had clearly concluded in Clara's favor, because he had developed the habit of sitting next to her wherever she was placed, and regarding anyone who came near her with a proprietorial suspicion that made Isaiah laugh every time. The homestead grew. The cattle herd expanded to 30, then 40. The house acquired a proper window in the second bedroom, and a third sleeping room added to the east side when it became necessary. The kitchen garden became a serious operation, with Gertrude corresponding with 2 other women in the region about seeds and soil management, and the particular challenges of desert growing. And the correspondence had become a kind of community, a loose network of women running land in a territory that was indifferent to them, and that they were quietly, methodically making theirs anyway. Reeves Crossing got a school by 1865, and Gertrude rode into town 3 afternoons a week for the first year of it, helping to set up the library, a generous description of 2 shelves of donated books, and making a case to the town council for hiring a proper teacher rather than relying on whoever had the most education and the most availability. The town council was 4 men who ranged from receptive to obstinate, and she made her case with the calm, well-organized directness she brought to anything she considered worth fighting for, and they hired a teacher by the following spring. Isaiah, when she told him the outcome, said of course they did, with the absolute confidence of someone who had never doubted the result. "You sound very certain," she said. "When have you lost an argument you decided to win?" he said. She thought about it. "There was the matter of the fence line in '63, she said. "You were right about the fence line in '63, he said. "It just took me 6 more weeks to see it." "That is not losing," she conceded. He was right. In the specific way, he was often right about her, not flattery, not exaggeration, but clear-eyed observation that gave her exactly the credit she had earned, and not an inch more or less. It was one of the many things she loved about him, that his seeing of her was accurate and complete, that she did not have to perform or diminish in either direction, that she was simply and fully known. In 1866, she found herself, on a clear October morning, sitting on the porch in the early light with a cup of coffee and Clara asleep on her lap, and Thomas somewhere in the barn conducting unauthorized negotiations with the horses, looking out at the desert that she and Isaiah had made into a home and thinking about everything the land had held. The route was 5 years gone and already legendary in the way that short, vivid things become legendary. People were writing about it, telling stories about it. A few of the writers had become figures of something approaching myth. The company had failed long before that, absorbed into the larger story of Western enterprise and Western failure and Western persistence, and the land it had crossed remained what it had always been: honest, enormous, completely indifferent to the ambitions of any individual moving across it. She heard the screen door and felt Isaiah sit beside her, setting his own cup down, reaching automatically to adjust the blanket around Clara where it had shifted. She leaned against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. They sat looking at the desert together in the early light. He said, "What are you thinking about?" "Everything," she said. "The route, Thomas, you arriving, the first run we did together. The sorrel that wanted to cut left," he said. She laughed, soft so as not to wake Clara. "The sorrel that wanted to cut left. You told me exactly what she would do," he said. "I remember thinking, this woman has paid very close attention." "I pay attention to things I care about," she said. "I know," he said. They watched the light change across the desert, from the first pale gold to the richer orange of the climbing sun, and the hills to the east went from dark shapes to textured and warm and entirely themselves. Arrow was in the corral, older now, a little heavier, still lean and quick when the occasion demanded it, and Caleb was beside him, the 2 horses standing companionably in the morning as they always did, close enough to touch. She thought about Craddock, about his flat official face and his papers, and about standing in the dust of Dry Creek Station and telling him that the mail needed to move. She thought about riding the 42 miles alone for 22 days, finding the meteor at mile 13, letting the grief come, and then letting it become something else. She thought about Isaiah arriving on Caleb with his saddlebag and his battered rifle, and his absolute inability to pretend that something inadequate was adequate. She thought about the morning he had said, simply, "You do not need replacing, Mrs. Leland." And how she had known, in the particular way you know things that matter, that he meant it entirely. "I think about that sometimes," she said aloud. "What you said to Craddock, that I was the most capable person on the route. I said it because it was true," he said. "I know," she said, "but it was more than that. It was," she thought about how to say it. "It was the first time in my life that someone was willing to tell a stranger in authority a true thing about me at cost to himself, without being asked, without any calculation of whether it served him." He was quiet, listening. She said, "I loved you for it before I knew I was going to love you." He pressed his lips to her temple, a small, quiet gesture that was one of his habitual expressions of things that were too large for words. She felt it all the way through. Thomas came out of the barn with hay in his hair, and the news that the gray mare had been friendlier than usual this morning, and he thought perhaps she was lonely, and should the family consider acquiring another horse. Isaiah addressed this proposal with complete seriousness, asking Thomas several clarifying questions about what evidence of loneliness he had observed, while Clara woke on Gertrude's lap and looked at her brother with the ancient, suspicious wisdom of a 2-year-old evaluating a situation. Gertrude watched her husband and her son discuss the emotional needs of horses in the morning light, on the porch of the house they had built, on the land they had chosen, and she thought that this particular accumulation of ordinary, specific, irreplaceable mornings was what she had been riding toward from the beginning. Not away from grief, not away from loss, but toward this. Toward the life that the riding made possible. The gray mare did, as it happened, seem happier with company. They acquired a second horse that spring, a young gelding with a steady eye that Thomas named Biscuit, which Isaiah accepted with only a minor expression of suffering. And the corral became a social arrangement that satisfied everyone involved, animal and human alike. By 1867, Pete Hadley had slowed down enough that his operation needed a steady hand more than occasional help, and Isaiah began spending 2 mornings a week working Pete's cattle alongside Pete's remaining hand, a quiet young man from Texas named Samuel who had come west after the war and was putting himself back together with the patience of someone who understood that such things took time. Gertrude had taken Samuel under an unofficial kind of practical wing, making sure he ate properly and had warm gear for the winters, in the matter-of-fact way she cared for things she felt responsible for. The network of women she corresponded with had grown into something more deliberate, 8 women across the region sharing information, experience, the kind of practical knowledge that made the difference between a homestead that survived and one that did not. She had started writing down what she knew about the land, about the seasons, about the particular demands and particular gifts of the desert country, in notebooks that she kept on the shelf beside Isaiah's Emerson, and the notebooks had multiplied, and she had the beginning of a thought about what they might become. She told Isaiah about the thought one evening, straightforwardly, the way she told him everything that mattered. She said she had been thinking about writing a guide for women coming west, for people who were going to be doing what she had done, making a life in country that did not accommodate the uninformed. Practical, specific, honest. He looked at her across the supper table with Thomas on one side and Clara on the other, and he said, "You should write it." "It would take time," she said. "Write it," he said again. She wrote it. Over the course of 2 years, in the mornings before the house was fully awake, in the lamplit quiet of the kitchen table, she wrote what she knew about the desert, about the land, about the specific techniques and the general principles and the particular spirit required to make something real out of nothing given. She wrote about riding the route alone and what that had asked of her and what it had given back. She wrote about building a house and a garden and a herd and a life in a country that required everything and rewarded effort with something that was not comfort but was better than comfort. Deep, earned competence and the particular satisfaction of a life that was genuinely and entirely your own. She sent it to a printer in Salt Lake City in the spring of 1869, a man named Whitfield who published practical guides and agricultural texts, and he wrote back that he would be glad to print it. It was not a famous book. It was not widely reviewed. But it found its way to people who needed it, passed from hand to hand across the territory, and Gertrude received letters about it for years, from women in Nevada and Utah and Wyoming and California, brief practical letters that said the same thing in different words. This helped. Isaiah read it in manuscript, every page, and gave her his honest assessment, which was rigorous and specific and deeply respectful, and when he finished he said, "This is the most useful thing I have read since my mother made me read Emerson." She had taken that as the high compliment he intended it. In the summer of 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed and the world changed again. The country that had been enormous became smaller, and the routes that had been miraculous became obsolete, and the stories of the riders and the routes passed into the particular golden haze that history applies to things that were brief and vivid, and entirely of their moment. Gertrude and Isaiah took the train east once, in 1870, to visit his brother in Ohio, a cheerful, large man named Daniel who had the same dark hair and the same quality of quiet attention, and who embraced Isaiah at the platform with the wordless force of someone who had been afraid of losing him to the distance and was deeply relieved to find him whole. He embraced Gertrude with the same force, which surprised her and delighted her in equal measure, and Thomas and Clara were received as the most interesting visitors to have arrived in years. They stayed 2 weeks. Ohio was green and wet and enclosed, and Gertrude found that she loved it in the way you love a place that is entirely foreign to your bones, with appreciation rather than belonging. On the last evening before they returned west, she and Isaiah stood in Daniel's garden in the warm Ohio night, and she said, "I understand the canal now. I understand why a person would leave here. It is beautiful," he said, "but it is not ours." "No," she said, "it is not." She took his hand and he held it, and the night was warm and full of fireflies, which the children had been chasing for an hour with the absolute commitment of people encountering something magical. And she watched Thomas and Clara run through Daniel's garden in the light of the fireflies and thought that this was a gift. This moment, these particular children, this particular man beside her, this long good life they were in the middle of. They went back. The train carried them west, and the country went from green to brown to the great particular gold of the desert. And when she stepped off the platform at Reeves Crossing and smelled the sage and the heat, and the mineral honesty of the air, she breathed in as if she had been holding her breath for 2 weeks without knowing it. Isaiah stood beside her with Thomas asleep against his shoulder and Clara awake and interested and pointing at everything, and he looked at her over the top of Thomas's head, and she saw him do the same thing she had done, take one deep breath of the desert air, like a person returning to something that is genuinely theirs. "Home," he said. "Home," she agreed. The years settled into themselves the way good years do, not without difficulty, because the land was never easy and the work was never done, and there were hard winters and dry summers, and the 1,000 ordinary and extraordinary challenges of a life built with hands and determination in unforgiving country. The cattle herd reached 60 head and then was reduced by a bad winter, and then rebuilt again with the same patient methodology. The children grew with the speed that children grow, which always seemed to Gertrude both impossibly fast and exactly right. Thomas at 7 was serious and curious and already a competent writer, with his father's quality of absolute attention and his mother's directness. Clara at 5 was a person of extraordinary will and considerable charm, and she had her parents' combined stubbornness plus something entirely her own, which was a quality of finding joy in things that resembled her paternal grandmother's philosophy about beauty in ordinary things, though she could not have known that. A third child arrived in 1872, a boy they named Daniel after Isaiah's brother, and he came into the world already seeming comfortable with the arrangement, a placid, sturdy infant who considered his situation and found it acceptable and slept accordingly. Pete Hadley held him and said he was the finest Brenner yet, which Thomas disputed on the grounds of prior establishment, and which Clara dismissed entirely on the grounds of self-evident superiority. Gertrude watched her family in the evenings, in the lantern light of the main room, Thomas reading, Clara conducting complicated social negotiations with the dog they had acquired 2 years before, a cattle dog named Dust, who was an excellent working animal and an enthusiastic house guest, and felt the fullness of it without needing to name it or qualify it. She had built this. She and Isaiah had built this together, out of the same material she had ridden through alone in the dark 22 days after Thomas Leland died: willingness, attention, endurance, and the fundamental insistence on moving forward. Isaiah, on the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary in September of 1871, had given her a gift that was characteristically him, a new journal leather-bound, with a small inscription on the inside cover in his precise, unhurried handwriting. It read, "For the next 10 years of what you notice." He had, she saw, already written the first line himself. "Today we are 10 years into the best decision of my life," and left the rest of the pages for her. She had stood in the main room holding it and had not been able to speak for a moment, which was rare for her, and he had watched her with the expression she had first seen in the lantern light during the storm at Simpson Park, that open and wondering look, and she had gone to him and held him the way she held the things she could not afford to lose, completely and without reservation. 10 more, she had said, into his shoulder. And 10 after that, he had said. She had written in the journal every day since. The ordinary and extraordinary things, the desert in different seasons, the children at different stages, the slow satisfaction of the cattle operation, the letters that came from women who had read her book, the particular quality of an October morning on the Nevada land, the ongoing, unfolding story of a life she had chosen and was choosing still. Every morning she woke beside Isaiah Brenner and rode out with him into the enormous, honest, beautiful desert that was theirs. On the morning of their 12th anniversary, a September morning in 1873 that was cool and golden and absolutely perfect, she rose before dawn the way she always rose and went to saddle Arrow, who was older now but still capable of the things she asked of him, and Isaiah came out 5 minutes later and saddled Caleb without a word, and they rode out together into the predawn dark, just the two of them, the way they had ridden 100 times, 1,000. Since the first morning she had said keep up and meant it, and he had. They rode the old route. Not all 42 miles, but the stretch near the spring, where the brittle bush went gold in spring and the desert lavender bloomed in the afternoon heat, where the second hill had the trail that the sorrel mare had always wanted to take, where the horizon was wider than anywhere else she had ever stood, wide enough to hold everything. The stars were still showing when they stopped at the top of the second hill and sat on their horses in the dark and looked at the sky. The old familiar sky. The sky that Thomas had loved and that she had ridden under alone, and that had given her a meteor at mile 13 to keep her going. Isaiah said, "Do you know what I thought about on the way out here?" "What?" she said. "The first morning, when I arrived and you told me to water my horse." He paused. "I thought, this is a woman who knows who she is, and I thought that I had never met anyone like that before, a person so completely themselves." He looked at the stars. "I still think that." She looked at him, this man who had arrived to replace her and had instead decided she needed no replacing, this man who had ridden beside her and argued with her and listened to her and married her and built a life with her in the country they both loved, this man who was the best thing that had come to her from the long, hard road of grief and determination. She said, "Isaiah Brenner." He looked at her. "I love you," she said, "with everything I have, more than the route, more than the land, more than the sky." She paused. "You are the best thing that ever rode up to a water trough in my life." He laughed, that full head-back laugh that she had been collecting for 12 years and never tired of hearing. Then he looked at her with everything he had, all of it present and unguarded and completely hers. He said, "Gertrude Brenner, you are the best thing that ever told me I was told wrong." She reached across and took his face in her hands, the way she had the first time, in the wet desert dark after the storm, and she kissed him with the 12 years in it, and the country around them, and the sky overhead, and the children still asleep in the house behind them, and all the morning still ahead. He kissed her back with the same weight and the same warmth and the same completely deliberate, completely meant quality that had characterized every single thing he had ever done in her direction. They rode home through the dawn. The sky went from black to deep blue to the first pale gold, and the desert opened around them, enormous and honest and entirely itself, and the horses moved together at an easy pace, and the house came into view ahead with the first smoke from the kitchen fire, where Thomas was probably already awake and helping himself to whatever was left from supper, and Clara's voice was probably already audible at some distance, arguing a principle she had identified in her sleep. And Daniel was probably sitting in his customary state of philosophical acceptance, of all circumstances. And the land was theirs, and the morning was theirs, and the life they had made together out of grief and stubbornness, and an honest man on a roan horse who had said simply, plainly, with complete sincerity, "You do not need replacing, that life was theirs, and it was good, and it was real, and it was the only thing in the end that any of it had ever been for." She rode home beside Isaiah Brenner, and the sun came up over the Nevada desert, and the land glowed gold, and the whole wide country said, as it always had, exactly what it was.